All right, hello everyone. So nice to see you all here, and thank you for making the time. All right, so let's get started, yeah? So before we, plunge in, I have a few questions for you. So here's one. Raise your hands for those who think that AI is taking your jobs. A lot of very secure people here, huh? Okay. Another question is AI threatening our democracy? Okay, a little more. So you're secure, but not for your, country. Okay. And the last is AI ruining our mental health. Wow, nobody? Oh, all right, okay. The backbenchers, all right. So, all right, a very confident crowd here. So, what's interesting is that in the last few years, and you all have seen this, right? Mainstream headlines, one after the other, is not just talking about these subjects. They've gone even further and said that it is terrorizing us, it's creating war, and even some say that it could cause extinction. In fact, the last few years, we have had so many books that have doubled down and are underlining how AI and digital media are ruining us and are really critical about everything tech. So, look at the number of books here, right? So this is, causing a deep amount of anxiety. So what's going on here? There's genuinely a battle between AI and society. There's this notion that AI is really oppressing and controlling us, and we as a society are trying to resist it, but we are no match against the big forces of big tech, right? So it feels like a sort of a David-Goliath situation, and we are on the losing end. So it is no wonder that we're feeling this sort of pessimism paralysis. It's not just a despair. It's this impotence towards all things digital. And here I am to tell you that while these concerns are legitimate, it is absolutely not the full picture and is absolutely imbalanced, because there's far more to be optimistic and hopeful about. So a recent headline in The Economist says, "Are American progressives making themselves sad?" And that comes from a new Gallup poll study which interviewed Americans, and many of the Americans reported saying that they are more unhappy today than they've been in years, okay? And this resonates with Europe too. However, this pessimism sentiment is not universally shared. The Global South, which counts as the majority of the population on this planet today, reports the very opposite sentiment of being very optimistic. So more than 9 in 10 young people in Kenya, Mexico, China, Nigeria, and India are optimistic about their futures. And Europe ranks at the bottom of the list. Some of the top countries in Europe, particularly in the south of Europe, rank in the bottom list. When it comes to AI and whether people feel that it's enhancing our productivity in the workplace, a lot of countries in the global south, like India, Indonesia, UAE, Mexico, are very optimistic. They do believe in it, whereas Europe and the US rank very low. And even with the climate change, where, by the way, the global south are at the forefront of its impact, they are still very optimistic about their futures. So what on earth is going on? Why is there this big divide between the West and the rest of the world when it comes to our outlook on AI and our futures? Is it because the global south just doesn't know what's happening? Or is it because they're just not connected enough and they're, trailing behind and they haven't yet felt the impact of the horribleness of AI and digital media? So, it's tempting to sort of come up with this narrative to justify, right, that these are digital have-nots, and they're ignorant and naive, and this is why they are optimistic. But that would be missing the real story going behind this optimism trend, which comes with 3 points, right? The demographics, culture, and growth aspirations. So demographics is that it is well worth reminding you all that 90%, let me underline, 90% of the world's youth live outside the West. That is the majority world, right? And this majority have fast come online in the last decade because of extraordinary disruptions in the data industry and the mobile industry, which have made mobile phones and data plans extraordinarily cheap in many parts of these worlds. And for the first time, they are becoming visible and heard to people like you. And they can actually have their voices out there, right? So there's a reason why they're optimistic. Second is about culture. It is well worth keeping in mind that majority of these people live in cultures which are very patriarchal and also religiously conservative. So there's a lot of social norms and pressures on them to conform. I am a product of that. I'm an Indian, coming from India, and I was born and brought up, and I escaped because I didn't want an arranged marriage. And there's a lot of stories. It's not even just about socioeconomics. It cuts across economic areas. The culture is a sticky factor. So in relation to that, the digital provides them a little more freedom to self-actualize, which is so fundamental to teenagers and young people who are trying to discover themselves. And the third is about growth aspirations. AI and digital innovations are helping these countries leapfrog into the development future because they have some seriously confounding crises and problems to encounter, whether it's access to digital health, access to healthcare, education, how do they conserve water resources? I mean, look at India. It's got 1.4 billion people. They've got to scale up. They have to build institutions. And, digital identity, there's a lot. And the digital will help them get there. Because here's something. The Global South are rational optimists. They understand that you have no choice but to be hopeful because that allows you control over your future. So in the last decade, we've seen the rise of the next billion users who are basically people who have come online for the first time, and they're making themselves visible and heard. Just India and China alone counts as a majority of the world today. And Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia are going to overtake everybody because of their youth dividend. And that is extraordinarily powerful, right? And far from being laggards, they are at the forefront for whether we are talking about fintech, we're talking about AVs, mobile health, name it, solar panels, etc., renewables. Many of the East Asia, China, India are pioneering new systems like digital infrastructures that are completely decades ahead of what's happening in Europe and the United States. So let me go back to the questions that I asked you all. Okay, and let's see it from the Global South perspective, shall we? Is AI taking our jobs? So meet Neil Renaud. They are a village influencer in the fashion area, and they basically use local resources to respond to global trends. They have more Instagram followers than most fashion brands today. They are the kind of people that are fueling the creator economy despite being at the margins of society. And, as their governments continue to fail them in coming up with decent job opportunities, they are forging ahead by gaming the metrics and really trying to be visible and heard and finding the niches to scale and connect with the global public online because they refuse to be the lost generation, right? Meet Lalita. She is absolutely enthusiastic about Facebook Live, which I know people already feel the shivers, oh, Facebook. But she loves it. And here's why. Because since the pandemic, when the shops, shut down, right, she basically took on to being online, and she became very successful in selling saris. And she gets a lot of compliments for her performance. This has given her, quite a bit of confidence and also a little leverage with her in-laws and her husband that she, connected to through an arranged marriage. Now, it is well worth noting that in the last few years, women's participation in the workforce in the global south are in the decline. And there's a double marginalization going on as our jobs get platformized, and culture really is a sticky factor because much of these patriarchal values are pushing them to still stay at home. So, is AI threatening our democracy? Second question, right? Here is a generated media image used by Iranian women activists to basically protest against the hijab in Iran. They're using AI to generate many such images like this to communicate really critical messages about how they have the right to wear and do whatever they want in public spaces, reclaiming their public spaces without putting actual people in harm's way. These people don't exist in reality, and that keeps people safe from the morality police and beyond. This is, from Miranda, who is a Bolivian artist. He generates these kinds of images to provoke and challenge stereotypes about Latin American indigenous communities. And basically, the idea is that these kinds of visuals can get amplified and multiplied and scaled and can fuel the training data sets, which will help us de-bias the internet and create a much more inclusive Creative Commons, right? Because when you Google, Indian woman or, indigenous woman, the stereotypes are still heavily prevailing today, which shapes the way we think about the world. And here you have young people in young democracies in Kenya, Namibia, Nigeria, who are very enthusiastic about their politics, and they want to embrace and make democracy, their own. So you have to understand countries like, say, Namibia, majority of their leaders are 70 plus, which seems to be a trend, right? Why not choose the people who have got one foot in the grave to represent us, particularly when 80% of the entire population is below 30 years of age? But you see, there's a lot of cultural norms when young Africans meet with their leaders in person because they can't be disrespectful to their elders. But when online, they can criticize their policies and take on their actual citizenship, which gives them a lot of hope. And they are very enthusiastic about global hashtag movements because they finally can get your attention to their local issues, whether it's Me Too, whether it's police brutality, and other kinds of hashtag movements. And the last is AI bad for mental health? Basically, I did this report with UNHCR, which is, a year-long fieldwork in Brazil amongst Venezuelan refugees, and my team basically engaged with many of these young people there. And what we found is that they were very enthusiastic about digital media. Far from opting out, they really want to opt in. They want to experience digital media to its fullest. And they desperately try to use their data packets for mainly social media. And why is that so? Here are two stories, and little snippets from the multiple voices we captured that tell you why they are optimistic with digital media. So here is one person who says, "My dream is to make videos because my story is hard to tell. I had 2 heart attacks and God raised me up. There are things I want the world to understand." She really wants to stop being forgotten. She wants to be humanized. And she feels that the refugees tend to get always forgotten. So the digital, unlike other physical spaces, which literally are extremely confining because oftentimes you can't leave the settlements, can allow them the freedom across borders. And this speaks for millions of people around the world. Another story from a Venezuelan gay refugee says, a picture I took expressing that I felt very lonely. That picture made it to the top 20. People loved it. I like that picture because it was with that picture that I understood that I have to value myself as a person. This is where he was coming out as being gay, and he felt validated on social media. So the romance economy. We cannot undermine that. In fact, I have talked time and again and underlined this because we take this so much for granted, that oftentimes it really matters why we get online and stay online. And it's not because we can get more jobs or get more information. That's not the main intrinsic motivating factors. It's usually to seek love, friendship, solidarity, these kinds of emotions. And if you keep in mind you're a teenager, whether you're in the global south or elsewhere, you are highly driven to understand about your sex and sexuality, your intimacy, romance. You want to have that, relationship, that buzz feeling. You want to understand what's going on with your body. Are you a freak? Are you normal? This is a fundamental question a teenager asks, right? Am I normal, right? And it's so closely tied to sex. But it's well worth remembering that 98% of young people in the global south will have an arranged marriage, and very few will get a dating experience. They're not on these dating apps. If you check any of the global south, it's marriage apps. And who is moderating it? Their parents, right? So, sex is a taboo in most parts of the global south. I grew up in India. Nobody talked to me even about menstruation. Forget sex. I just discovered it. I learned about sex through, I think, a bad girl in school who got a Playboy. And we're like, oh, she's horrible, but it's interesting about sex, yes. So, and I come from an educated middle-class family. So you can imagine this is a confounding, sticky factor. Sex doesn't get talked about in schools, in families, among your friends, in the media. It almost doesn't exist because babies just get born, right? And so, maybe there's a reason why India's got a 1.4 billion population and going strong, because we really love talking about sex. So, actually, like doing sex, right? Anyway. But look, relative to this situation, which is really fundamental to self-actualization and normalizing these, so-called pathological behaviors, it is really important to underline how simple technologies like ChatGPT can normalize and make a lot of situations which seem confounding very accessible to teenagers whose minds are completely, filled with these overarching questions to take over their young minds. So this image, by the way, was circulated. I did this 3-year project on digital romance in, Brazil and India, and we were trying to understand how teenagers were understanding digital privacy, and the fundamental lens through which we could talk about it was romance. And this is where I realized it was the single biggest driving factor to why teenagers got online and stayed online, And they were learning all kinds of techniques to, reach out to different populations. In fact, they had full-fledged relationships where, like, Indian boys in slums were having full-fledged girlfriends in Brazil, and they even learned Google Translate. And they were using, Portuguese to chat with their girlfriends, and so it was very, very fascinating. This whole romance ecosystem that is so alien to our world. And the other interesting statistic, which is also humbling for us to remember, is that less than 5% of the world's countries have liberal democracies, where we can just, go to a bar and, it's not like so shocking if you go on a date or wear what I'm wearing, or even half sleeves. When I was growing up, this was like, my parents were like, are you walking out like this? What are the neighbors gonna think? You're showing your arms. And this is something really alien, right? Because the mundanity of, this part, or your arms, or menstruation, or pubic hair, or, all the stuff which is natural is so pathological in many of these countries, including how I grew up. So, look, we need to burst the pessimism bubble we are in, because it is a very dark time, and I get it. But it is really important to be optimistic. And also to be optimistic about AI and digital innovations does not necessarily translate to dismissing the actual harms and risks. It's like saying that if I say one good thing about Chinese digital innovation, I'm also condoning anything they do with human rights. What's going on today? Because intellectual honesty demands that we break out of these binary cults that have taken control of the way we talk to each other. Are you in this camp or that camp? Are you pro-Israel, pro-Palestine? What are you? It's almost like it defines your entire identity, and there's zero space for nuance. Because every time I present this, in the last few weeks, people are like, so you're dismissing all the harms and risks because you're so optimistic? How naive are you? Or maybe you're really reducing up, concerns. And it's interesting because I can flip the side. I'm like, oh, so are you dismissing all the optimism? Do you not care about what they feel? Right? It doesn't work that way, right? Because in the end of the day, we need to forge forward. Because, also it is important to understand that critique without action is a certain kind of easy way out. In fact, pessimism is a privilege for those who can afford to live in despair. The rest of the world has no choice but to forge ahead with hope because their future depends on it. It is not naive to be optimistic, which is oftentimes what I get. Oh, you're so naive, so sweet, But is it naive for Afghanistani women to protest, against the Ayatollahs in Iran, for their fundamental right to wear what they want? Or is it naive for Ukrainians to take on the might of the Russian forces for their sovereignty? Or is it naive for Yemeni and Ugandan gay men to come out online despite the fact that homosexuality is criminalized in most parts of the world? Most parts of the world. And we don't talk enough about that. And so that's why we lack the empathy that they're going through, because no wonder in comparison to that, the digital allows them a little way in which they can exercise their agency, right? The fact is that there's power in number, and the global south has that in abundance. And if they can be optimistic despite the chronic challenges they have in front of them, then surely so can we, right? So before I wrap up, I have a request from all of you. I'd like you to stand up if you can, okay? I know, it's an afternoon exercise, yes. And then just slump like a question mark and let all your air out. Right? And then take a deep breath and straighten your back as much as possible. How does that feel? Basically, our body is a metaphor for our mind. If we let the air of hope in, we can then steer it towards the winds of change. So I hope you get on the bandwagon and be optimistic like the rest of the world, because we have a lot of work to do. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Payal, Arora. I have a couple of questions, and because I'm very lazy, I asked if we could have some chairs so we can sit and talk a little bit. And then we're also going to give you the opportunity to ask questions. We'll have someone with mics two people with mics walking around, but please have a seat.
I like sitting because she's much taller than me, so now I can be on the same
Ah,
level.
actually we can stand. No, I'm
And you
kidding.
can see my shoes better.
I love
So
your
I'll
shoes.
do that.
Thank you so much. This was so insightful in many different ways. I'm from Rwanda. I think I've said this yesterday about 700 times. I like to insert it whenever I can. And I was so surprised coming from Germany. I've lived most of my life in Germany, but I was born and raised in Rwanda. And in Berlin, when I try to buy anything, I always have to pay with cash, and I never have cash on me. And in Rwanda, everyone was paying everything with mobile money, cabs, electricity, and I didn't have it, like I didn't know how to do it. I've never felt more like my mom than in that moment. So I'm wondering, when you say, they're not really digital have-nots, actually people from the global south are at the digital forefront and have, some type of like pioneering role in this. Could you maybe expand on it a little bit more?
Yeah, absolutely. And I so resonate with you because every time I go to India, I feel like I'm coming from a backward place and going, and they're like, don't you know, like my mother's giving me tips. I'm like, and she's in her 70s, and now she wants to set up a granny channel who is doing pole dancing, and she wants to teach other Indian women plus 70, but her target audience is 85 plus, so she can feel younger. And I was like, what? There's so much going on because there's a definite leapfrogging, And, I used to live in the US where they still do checks. I get a check still from the American government once in a while during the pandemic. I'm like, the Dutch don't even process checks, right? So
it's still processed.
Well, the Americans.
Aside from the Americans.
But the thing is, what's crazy is that time and again, I do a lot of consulting with American tech companies, and they ask me this again and again. Yeah, but are they even online? Do they even have a phone? And I was like, dudes, you are really backwards in comparison. Like, get on the bandwagon. And I land up spending a lot of energy trying to school them that there's a lot going on. A good example is, it should give us pause that Elon Musk, who basically is usually looked upon as the forefront of, future innovation, is the one who said, well, we should contain China and its AVs because they are going to kill the German industry and the American AV industry. What's funny is a couple of years ago when he was asked about Chinese AV cars, he actually laughed. He's like, have you seen their cars? And today he's at the forefront, please. And by the way, now a secret deal, I think, has been achieved because now he's back on the bandwagon saying, yay, China. So, we need to wake up and realize a lot of developments are happening in the global south, and we shouldn't put it on them to school us. We need to school ourselves if we want to be competitive genuinely in this global marketplace.
I wholeheartedly agree. But I ask myself, some of the anxiety surrounding all these topics, don't they have a point maybe a little bit? Like you gave a great example about the empowerment side of things, being able to discuss usually taboo topics in one society, being able to have that discussion digitally and maybe in some forms in a more anonymous way. But I just had a son like a year and a half ago, and I keep thinking like he's going to grow up with like social media. So in many ways, I'm also a little bit anxious thinking about how different his life and upbringing will be just because of the technology that is at his fingertips. So I'm asking you, do you think some of the anxiety maybe is a little bit justified in ways?
Look, absolutely, the concerns are very legitimate. We really, really need to build guardrails to ensure that AI and digital media work for the well-being of society. Absolutely true. My problem is the ones who are invested in criticizing basically double down, and even though they say their critique is meant to be positive, what they do is they really make us so depressed that we feel impotent. When you say algorithms are racist, algorithms are sexist, then it's basically that the system needs to be controlled. You ask different kinds of questions, then we need to break it down, control it, because you feel like it's against you.
Yeah.
So your mentality is not looking at it as a tool that can be useful if the right guardrails are put, but more about it's the enemy camp. And there's a sort of momentum because it's much more citable, it's an easier narrative to go viral, and I think it's irresponsible as a narrative because it doesn't allow for the nuance that we need to work with these technologies, not against them, and we need to ensure that we build the guardrails so it can be of service to ourselves and the planet, right?
But how could these guardrails look like? Because, I mean, some algorithms, because they're made by humans, could, be as racist as humans can be, right? I wouldn't argue against that, but I'm interested in hearing how. I mean, I agree also that it's kind of it's the way you word certain things,
Yeah.
but how would those guardrails look like?
Yeah, so for example, when we look at algorithms, it's a way we also look at education. If you have somebody who says a racist remark to you, are you going to say there's no hope? You're a racist person, that's it. Are you going to, so if you're in a school and a child says a racist remark, you're like, that's a lost cause, you're racist. How do you proceed forward versus saying that is a racist comment and here is why? Let's explore that, and then you basically are retraining that young mind to move in a direction. And the algorithm is the same thing. It's not frozen in time. It is a reflection
Dynamic,
of cumulative values, and we need to constantly work at it. So simple things like you need to have independent auditing boards, right, which are like watchdogs, which are basically continuously looking at how the algorithms are working. Is it, testing and trying the boringness of things? We need to get into the boringness of things. Just like democracy. Democracy is not like just achieved and then we relax. As we all know, it's work. It's like a relationship. When you get married, you're like, all right, I'm going to have a great marriage. Anyone who's been married will know that's bullshit, right? So I look at it as we are married to these digital tools, and if we want to keep that marriage alive, we need to constantly train it because our values are changing too. Our cultures are changing too. So we need to ensure it is constantly in alignment with what we hold dear. And there are certain crises, like the planetary crisis, that has become more urgent than ever before. And that's a new value that, wasn't as urgent, say, 10 years ago, right?
But couldn't you argue that it's not that our values change and adapt to whatever is happening in the digital space, but more that the digital space and tech change our values, or it doesn't work like that?
Like a relationship, it does impact. There is a two-way process, isn't it? It's dialectical. So and like I said again, it's a relationship.
Yeah.
But what we do need to ensure is that we cannot take the digital as sacrosanct because oftentimes the participation is really a sliver. So, for example, on Twitter, it's like majority of them are oftentimes male, white, or in particular privileged countries and positions, and are not reflective of our entire world.
Yeah.
So we can't say, oh, but that's the value of the population. No, it's not. It's a tiny sliver, right? And also we know that the certain kinds of algorithms are profiling the sort of extreme speech. That's a guardrail already, is how these algorithms are, rewarding certain kinds of speech. What kind of content moderation? These are, again, boringness of details about content moderation, regulation. All that stuff is really important. But you will only start asking these questions if you care, right? Which is a theme of this whole event, is why should you care? Because I am saying that the digital spaces have a tremendous amount of value for all of us. We take it for granted in many ways, so it's easier to criticize it because we have alternative public spaces and institutions that we can rely on. But in many parts of the world, most parts of the world, it's still very fundamental to pivoting their cultures. And that's why they're enthusiastic about it.
I mean, I get that. I think if you compare the West and maybe the global South, you talked about self-actualization. I think we're in different steps in our development, if you could say it that way. I'm interested in knowing, though, because you talked about independent boards that could help regulate, that could act as some type of watchdog. What about like state regulations, or do we want to keep politicians and governments out of that?
I mean, look, state regulation is really important, but as I mentioned, the statistic to you that less than 5% of the world's countries have liberal democracies. So let's not assume the state is on your side, right? I mean, many of the states are doubling down on patriarchal laws. Like, for the longest time, Saudi Arabia, had laws in place that guarantee that women had the rights of children. So that's why you had the guardianship system. That's why you had apps that legally tracked women, and ensure that they always were accompanied by their brothers or husbands or fathers, right? Until very recently. So let's not assume the state is on our side, but when they are on our side, of course, we have to have high standards for them because they represent us.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of fledgling democracies, democracies that are weakening, and we need to double down and strengthen it, which is what's happening right now, right?
Yeah.
So absolutely, we need to work with politicians. And the way, just recently, I think a week or so ago, people said, some people told me, like, oh, you work with the people in the Indian government. I mean, you're just complicit with a fascist regime. And I was like, do you know if that's the case, I probably should not work with majority of the world?
Yeah.
Because that's the majority of the world. It has a spectrum from authoritarianism to paternalism. And most importantly, they're always good people in bad systems. That's what will give us hope. Identify the critical change makers from within, because that's how you make change, not just from regulation and imposing on the outside, because people from within can also make change.
Yeah.
And together we can move forward. It's not either or, right?
I agree wholeheartedly. And I also think sometimes when we have these discussions, I always wonder, what would the flip side be? To never engage with people or systems that I fundamentally disagree with, I never know. You said something so interesting. You said AI can help de-bias the world. Can you maybe elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, so basically, when you look at when you Google image certain, terms like Indian women, like I just did a recent project with my team, and we were trying to de-bias how Indian women at work are represented on Creative Commons. And there's some really strong, stereotypes. Like, for example, workplaces, right? Many of the women's workplaces in India are in their kitchens, for example, because they work in their kitchens doing bangles, doing care work. There's no office work. There's a sort of a bias towards oh, you're at an office at your laptop. They are on the streets, at the street. So the street is their workplace.
Yeah.
So it gives different meanings. So when we have these images prop up, it fundamentally changes your biases of how you see the world. It expands the spectrum of possibility, and it creates a certain sense of humility, which is really essential as we move forward. So de-biasing allows us to genuinely include different worldviews, different people's livelihoods, ways of living, so we can ensure that the policies and designs and practices work for the rest of the world.
Wouldn't critics argue that if these images, for example, are AI generated, that they're not realistic depictions of what is happening? Wouldn't they say, I don't know, why don't you use regular pictures? Why would you have to generate them via AI if that's the reality?
It's funny because that's exactly what someone told me as when we were applying for a grant. They're like, this is actually, they went even beyond what you said.
Yeah.
They said it's unethical to circulate images that are not descriptive of the context. It has to be authentic. But what is authenticity when you have very limited freedoms in actually expressing yourself, right? So if you're in Iran and in order to genuinely show who you are, you have to put yourself at harm's way, even put yourself at the risk of death just to show yourself.
Yeah.
So there's a reason there's a whole genre of aspirational aspirational imagery, which can be more authentic to your self-actualization than what is representative in a descriptive manner, right?
Yeah.
Because your lived reality does not allow you to do it without extraordinary harm to you, your community, your family at large. And so that's, again, a point of humility, which we all take for granted because we can, like I say, where we want, kiss people on the street, in general, right?
In general, yeah.
So
I do, the point of being authentic or not is also really sometimes funny to me because I always wonder from which perspective we're arguing this. I don't know if you've seen the movie American Fiction, but it's also, I don't know why I started this because now I have to explain the movie, but it's a great movie and you should watch it. And the author, it's portrayed by Issa Rae, and she writes a book that's like a best-selling book, and the critics love the book. And they say it's an authentic description of the African-American reality, whatever that is, the singular African-American reality. And then another black person in the book, in the movie, argues that that's not the authentic depiction of African Americans. So it kind of goes like back and forth. So I always think when someone says, well, that's not an authentic African American reality or Indian reality or African reality, I always wonder what kind of authenticity they're kind of like talking about actually, and what pictures they want to reinforce.
Absolutely. In fact, I really struggle with this notion of why are we so obsessed about authenticity? Because basically, what it translates to is that you are supposed to be in a particular box, right? Because it can be strategic because, say, if you're a collective trying to mobilize, right? Like there's a reason, like you want to be seen in particular ways. So, for example, if I'm a Indian woman who wants to show that I can be good in technology, right? And I will double down on that. So I will showcase myself in the laptop. I will push for that narrative because the larger narrative is the opposite. It's like a passive woman, blah, 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 right? And who cannot do all these IT things. But that's based on their vantage point, whereas a woman in a village in India will say, I also matter because just because I'm wearing a sari and a bindi and I'm sitting in the kitchen and doing beadwork, it doesn't make me lesser. Because actually it's back-breaking work. And you know what? I support my full family. My guy is drunk outside and I have 3 kids and I'm doing all this stuff. And I'm actually proud of myself. And that's also authentic to her lived. So I think we are way over-obsessed about authenticity, and we need to allow, and I think that's the power of diversity, is that create a diversity of representation and also allow critical change makers from people of color and other marginalized communities so they don't have to represent their whole community.
Yes.
Absolutely. I'm tired of being a token. Very often I find myself as the only woman of color, and then I supposed to speak for the rest of, the whole of the global south. Come on, right? And so I yearn for many of them where I can just be me. Yeah. And that allows for everyone to really be more free in a way, right?
I totally agree, because I think it reminds me of what Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie warned us about, like the danger of a single story, just to allow everyone to have like different nuances to who they are, and which adds more depth to, and is much more realistic of the human experience that we kind of all, which is a universal experience essentially. Yes, we can start taking in some questions from the public actually, because this timer is making me very nervous, but it's still green, so that's good. So if anyone has a question, we have someone with a mic. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much, both of you. That's a super interesting discussion. I wanted to ask Payal, so you mentioned something about, how we talk about how, for example, algorithms are racist and sort of like how we're doomed into these dynamics, right? And our power to possibly change that. But I kept thinking, how do the power struggles that we see in society end up having an impact on that, right? Because unlike when a child is racist and you want to correct their behavior or something, I think in our digital world, we are less powerful than these sort of racist structures, right? At least that's how I feel. And I think that that's what ends up generating this pessimism that we see in Europe. And I believe that the pessimism is then what leads to policies that end up protecting people, right, against these systems. I come from the global south and I live in Germany, and oftentimes I find myself feeling more secure online when I browse on the internet here than when I do back home, because I know that here the regulations put in place protect me, and I feel like it comes from this pessimism, right? So how do you think that like we should navigate sort of like the balance between being optimistic and pessimistic, and then use the sort of thought and feeling to maybe shift the power struggles in society?
Yeah, I think your question is probably very deeply resonant with many other people, because I think it's very valid. Because look, the fact is big tech is extraordinarily powerful. I mean, big tech is like more richer than most countries in the world today, just the top 5, right? And so, yes, that's a legitimate concern. But I also underline the fact about there's a power in numbers. And with the digital, you really can't push the algorithm when you have a collective online. So and that responds to numbers. So that's what I was emphasizing about the gaming the metrics. I was astonished because I've been doing a lot of ground level research, particularly on marginalized communities in India, Kenya, and Ecuador more recently, Namibia. And they are very savvy. These teenagers really know how to game the metrics, because the thing is, English is not their main language. They're using audio-visual, TikTok, other platforms. They have to figure it out. How do they get seen and heard? How do they ride that wave? And they also like to get attention to their causes. So you see, like when you go on TikTok, you see exposure to all sorts of different movements, campaigns, etc., which normally you wouldn't actually seek for, but it comes to you. And that is the power of collectivity online, right? Because it's always in relation to what? I mean, we always have to ask ourselves, why are they optimistic? It's in relation to what is their current existing structure. So the reality is in the global south, indeed, like you say, a lot of them are authoritarian or are very confounding in their oppressiveness. But it's interesting that the digital can be a sort of factor. So, for example, here's the irony. Sometimes people in authoritarian regimes actually resort to companies like Twitter or other companies like Google because they are so powerful that they are one of the few instruments that can actually oppose an authoritarian regime, bizarrely. So it's not a simplistic narrative that they are automatically on the side of the authoritarian regimes out there in the global south. Sometimes they are. But this goes to another movement, not just user collectives. It's also people from within the companies. We see this in the last years where the employees at Google just said, you know what, we're not working on this program. Because in the end of the day, these companies are made up of people who want to do right. I mean, after all, remember the slogan, don't be evil and all that stuff at the beginning of the internet? And many people still feel that, right? They're like, we want to be on the right side. I want to feel proud. And the new generation, the Gen Z, are selecting places where they can feel good about themselves. And that becomes talent competitiveness, which means that companies, just for their own self-interest, will do the right thing because they want to get the best talent. So there is a much richer agency than we give ourselves credit for. And the fact is, I will ask you all, have you ever been able to mobilize yourself when you're depressed? Like, I've had burnouts, and when I'm burnt out, I've been very depressed, and I've been unable to see the world. I can't even get myself to act. And when I have to really re-channel myself, and when I genuinely start to see the good, and I get a little hope, I actually have momentum to act, right? Because the problems stay, but is my energy to act there? It only comes from optimism, not pessimism. So I'm saying we are on the same page. But pessimism has rarely created change. It takes deep courage to be optimistic because it buys us that time to institute change. You know?
Thank you so much for that thoughtful answer. There was one other question here in the front. I want to urge everyone in the back as well. We're willing to travel with the microphone and take your questions.
Hi, I attended another talk today by Zara Rahman. She wrote a book called Machine Readable Me, and she talked about how, yes, the algorithms are racist, misogynist, whatever, but it's not actually the algorithms, but it's the systems, the structures, the society behind. And that we need to break up the things behind the algorithm. It's not the technology that is bad. Are you connected in any way to her work, or do you also have views that are similar, that it's not so much the technology that is bad, but yeah, it's just the systems, the structures behind it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is, by the way, what I was talking about with the Bolivian artist Miranda, because it's not the algorithm per se, but it's the data set that goes into the training of AI that shapes the way in which, say, the results are. And so if you can change the nature of data, you know, like for example, you're debiasing data, you're trying to come up with multiple ways in which you can represent people. And I'm part of many initiatives right now, like part of a Horizon European grant where we are creating synthetic CVs which are basically intersectional and feminist and representing people who are at the margins and often underrepresented in, say, when you look for CEOs, right? You expect recruitment systems to recommend what kind of CEO positions are there and who should see it. You know, the big debacle with Amazon just mainly recommending other white men for that was based on a data set which said, well, the past CVs were mainly CEOs who happen to be white male. So, well, we'll recommend to white male for these positions. And so we are literally at play trying to build data sets which can actually, you know, come up with other kinds of CVs to diversify that sort of end result. So same thing with creative data, right? So we are working with another group to do exactly that with artists like Miranda and others such. So absolutely, I'm on the same page, because to think that, you know, we cannot essentialize technologies, because the moment you essentialize a technology, it means you've given up on it. And we are not giving up on it because are we giving up on a fight? Because this is something that can be very powerful for us if we use it in a way which works for us. So let's come up with more kind of solutions which ensure it works for us.
Thank you so much. Do we have another question? Yesterday, my contact lens fell out. Oh, sorry, I'm going to tell that story later. It's okay. It's not a great story.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Payal. Thank you, Anna, for the marvelous talk and the discussion. I'm coming here from Berlin, so I'm from the global north, to say, and I'm very open and willing to learn about the experiences of the global south. And one aspect was very, interesting, I thought, when you're talking about digital infrastructures and the big tech companies. They are type of closed shop and infrastructure which not permits a lot of change. We have business models behind these algorithms, behind social networks. So my question is, to which extent that this is really possible to be optimistic and to make real change within these frameworks? We have initiatives like the Global Innovation Gathering, for example, who promotes open source software within the Global South and Global South North. So my idea would be that more the independent infrastructure would be more willing or more comfortable to change. But within these business models and frameworks of the big tech, I'm very doubtful how change is possible or not. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a very good question. And I think, you know, one of the beauties about you can create this amazing business model, and particularly, you know, to consolidate power, right? They call it like this tech oligarchs. And so basically, all the kill zones of innovation. And there's been so much work around it, which says that, shit, we're basically stuck with the system because when they have this extraordinary power, then how do we make a difference? But here's the thing. So I'll give you a concrete example. Like in India, they've come up with the biggest digital public infrastructure in the world today, which, by the way, should have come from Europe, because we've been trying to do that, where basically it is open source and accessible to all entrepreneurs who want to create companies and don't have to pay the ransom to iOS and Android to use their systems, right? And so what is interesting is that when the government created this digital public infrastructure a few years ago, there was a solid business model of fintech, which was all about, all with this XYZ service fees, et cetera, and all of that killed it when it was for free with the digital public infrastructure. So new forms of entrepreneurship has already risen in the last year alone, which basically has disrupted that business model. So what's interesting is that you can come up with a sort of a, it's like the auto industry in Germany, right? It's like they have built a solid business model, and now they see that they can be really left behind because it's no longer an auto industry, it's a data industry. And it's happening, and also not only that, renewable industry. And now they're seriously panicking. And they're hoping by some miracle it'll all be fine, but it's not, because what they've built is a very different kind of age-old traditional industry, and if they don't pivot and start to be humble and look at what's happening elsewhere, so basically they're going to be entrants to a very different business model. And those AVs are going to really help with the planet, because we do need to come up with legitimate solutions. So there's many such examples where you can build a fortress, but change is happening outside the fortress. And we have seen that time and again, and that is our hope. So, yeah.
That's a great answer. Thank you so much. Let me just scan the room for another hand. If not, I'll add to it, actually. I won't add to it. Where's the other hand? There it is.
The lady there.
With the stripes. Perfect.
I'm Tanzia. I'm from Bangladesh, so Global South, and I've been living in Berlin for more than 10 years now. Well, I've been very active in social media, and I see different things which in recent time I'm seeing the change because of we call it KI, künstliche Intelligenz, or artificial intelligence. And like, for example, the very first thing, we had a session last year in Republica here in Berlin, and I posted lots of posts regarding that in Facebook, Meta, and also Instagram. And then the first thing happened when Facebook started experimenting with AI, implementing AI more vigorously. All the Republica-related posts were down. So this time, when I again joined Republica, and I saw there is lots of talk about artificial intelligence, and I was wondering, so is it because Republica want to be seen in Facebook? For example. So this is one thing concerns me, because when I've been online since, end of 90s, and now I feel that with artificial intelligence, one head actually multiplies. Like when there was a background, maybe 50 people were ruling things, now basically one brain, and that is multiplied to 500,000 or 5 million or so. So at the end, these big companies are one way or another controlling, and I find they are more controlling with the artificial intelligence. For example, I've been a regular Google reviewer for different things, because I used to think, okay, people can read my review for things and they can understand, okay, should I go to this restaurant, or should I travel here or there, something like that. But in recent time, I have stopped writing Google reviews, because at the moment when I write Google reviews, many times when I use some critical keywords, AI stops me from posting that. And no matter how many times I make an appeal on Google review, they keep on rejecting. And for example, I realized that some specific business names, when I use that as artificial, and then AI actually puts them down. And the moment I replace only those keywords for specific businesses, then they allow me. For example, booking.com. If I write something mentioning booking.com, Google never allows me to post that. So probably booking.com doesn't pay Google for their ads, and that's why it doesn't work. So same way, I find it also very concerning what's happening in Global South. I see lots of online businesses are cherishing. My area of studies are only Pakistan, Bangladesh, and India. That's what I have observed. And there I see, okay, there are lots of business pages are popping up every single day, either in TikTok, Instagram, or Facebook, and then you don't know actually whether they are paying taxes or not, whether it's a scam or not. You pay someone, you trust their ads, and then you got scammed. Compared to that, these scamming processes are much less in Europe, especially in Germany. And I hate setting up any business in Germany because there are thousands and thousands of regulations and tax regulations, how to apply for this, and you have to suffer for 2-3 years before you found a startup here. But still, at least I know that the consumers are safe. And that's where concerns me that probably this AI thing is basically multiplying the big shots. What they want to think, they are just multiplying with AI.
What's your,
way,
sorry.
Only just the last point. For example, I live in Berlin. So the Berlin government's information website is berlin.de. And often Facebook removes this post when this is linked to berlin.de. And I feel concerned that I cannot post my city post on Facebook.
But do you have a question attached to the comment?
So basically my point is that here maybe people think that, or according to this presentation, that Global South is expanding. But I have the feel basically Global South is also led by Global North with the help of AI. So do you agree or not? That's my question.
All right.
Thank you so much.
It looks like anyway, thank you for sharing your concerns. And basically what you're trying to underline, which I agree, is that there's a lot of work to be done. And we have the political economies, which we've inherited from, the post-colonial times, where we really need to still unpack in those relationships between the global north and south and rethink entire populations and powers dynamics. So there is work to be done, but it comes from, agency, which comes from optimism. And that is fundamental because, as I said, you cannot act from a position of darkness. And so we have to move, and we have to give credit to people who, despite these chronic issues, are moving ahead and forging ahead. And we can learn and get inspired from that.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'm sorry. Thank you so much for your comment, but we have to look at the time. I want to thank you so much for your time. Thank you for the insightful presentation that you gave us, but also for answering all these questions. Payal, Arora, everyone, thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. And thank you.
Thank you.